With CA's most recent announcements of both the saga setting and the next DLC for Rome 2 Total War were posed for another big announcement from that camp. And I mean, could it be the final announcement of the DLC race of Total War Warhammer? Who knows? I mean, they did just do their big blog update where they talk about the new reprisal patch that is coming. That's going to be adding pretty much a lot of what we saw in the Foundation update. You know, the Warriors of Chaos design changes, the Wood Elf followers, the Empire start position overhaul, new skill trees and everything like that. But they also have said that ahead of the Foundation update, we will be getting immortality added to the old world characters. Bordelot now begins a war with Mousillon, plus a lot of other stuff such as, you know, Norska. But they did say that that will be coming ahead of the reprisal update because they think we want to see it. They know we want to see it first. So that does kind of put a weird timeline on the Tomb Kings, but who's to say when that's going to fall? I personally think it's going to be sooner rather than later. The Tomb Kings are a great frontrunner for the next faction DLC and would really make a lot of sense as another means of diversity on the battle map as well. You know, with the Lizardmen and Skaven in the Southlands, there's definitely plenty of room for another major faction. The Tomb King's presence in the Land of the Dead is already occupied by generic Vampire Count armies like the Strigoi and the Neckarchs, but it would just make a lot of sense there. So let's go back, way back in this kind of two-part video. Today we're going to discuss the torrid history of the Tomb Kings, or as they were known back then, the Priest Kings of Nehekhara. And then in our second video, we will be going into an individual unit and roster of the Tomb Kings like we have with the previous races. So we really kind of have to take a step back here. So this is the origin of the Tomb Kings first, and as they're called then, the Priest Kings. And this is a pre-Sigmar, so this is way back. So the origins of the ancient Nehekharan predates all of the Empire, actually. And this is a time way before Sigmar comes about to really unite the barbarian tribes of the north into one grand empire to beat back the Greenskins. Beat them Greenskins off, but that's never mind. There's a big origin story, as it were, for the Tomb Kings, and it's actually kind of cool. Just as an obvious duh moment, you'll find that a lot of the Tomb King history / pantheon draws direct references to dynastic Egypt. So if you're a fan of that era, you should feel really right at home. Only there's no cats. Screw cats. They have weapons for hands. So I'm not even a little bit down for that. But Nehekhara resides in what is called the Great Land, or the Fertile Crescent, or I mean the Land of the Dead. Land of the Dead. This is where the desert gods or the old gods fought tirelessly with these demons and that had to beset the land during what might actually be the Great Catastrophe. And in our Great Catastrophe video, we covered what actually happens in the world outside of the high elf, outside of the dwarf, and outside of the lizardman arenas, and we get a little bit of the smattering of the desert gods and how they're battling against these demons. And you've got Petra, the sun god and head of the Nehekhara pantheon, leading the majority of these assaults against these demons, driving them really from the land. And afterward, the pantheon made a pact with the nomadic peoples kind of indigenous to the area, and they kind of said, hey, we'll give you this luscious, bountiful land in exchange for their worship and devotion. And from there, and that's an important note right there, in their worship and devotion, and we're going to get back to that. But from there, the civilization really began, and with it, the troubles of really any civilization. This is where you've got this founding area, this kind of beginning of who we're going to see is probably one of the most pivotal characters in not just the Tomb Kings lore, but the lore of Warhammer as a whole with Settra. And this is where things really turn to a very Egyptian culture. You have these beautiful monuments, you know, scaling into the skies, constructed out of limestone and various materials, very similar to the Egypt of antiquity. You know, these pyramids that are covered from peak to base in limestone. The pyramids of old were covered in limestone to the point where they were just reflective. You would not be able to look at them dead on in the evening or in the afternoon sun. With this immense infrastructure that spans the entire empire, and these port systems to increase trade. You've got Alexandria, this big port city, and essentially you have a flourishing period of early Nehekharan society. And Khemri rose amongst all the other cities as the city of kings and the house of Far. I mean king of Nehekhara, not the pharaoh. So here's what's important to note here. While the king of Khemri was the king of the entire nation, each city has its own king. This is where the Tomb King name comes from. There are multiple, but only one rules supreme. So we'll get into him soon, don't worry. But what I'm trying to say is that you hear of the King of Khemri, and he is more or less the King of Kings. He controls all the other kings of all their respective cities. There's a Xandri king, and so on and so forth. So these kings brought about unity and peace to the land by essentially quelling all these threats outside of the kingdom. You have these greenskins, you bring all these nomadic tribesmen under one banner. Araby would not be included in this, and that's kind of important to note, as they are much further to the west, and they're separated by a desert. The desert called the Great Desert of Araby. Very original. But as all kingdoms kind of grow, so do the ambitions of their leaders, these kings. And Nehekhara had truly grown beyond its means. I mean, to the far east, over the mountains and into the Darklands, that's where you get Lamia. And to the north, that would be what would become eventually the border princes. So from this spurred a series of civil wars. And as each king vied for the crown of Khemri, that king of kings position, and thus dominion over the entirety of Nehekharan society. And this started to really bleed the nation dry, as the infighting really meant that no armies could watch the borders of the newly kind of carved empire. And the empire, the fledgling empire, basically just tribesmen at this point, and greenskins of the north really drove the Tomb Kings out of those lands. And in the book, it talks about these scaled beasts attacking their southern regions. Guys, it's the lizardmen. It's kind of obvious. But the lizardmen in the south, they completely destroy Liberus and really redrew the southern border of the Tomb King Empire, the Nehekharan Empire. And of course, the Tomb Kings were not Tomb Kings at this time. They were men of flesh and blood, so they did not have this limitless horde to defend against all these threats, including the threat to their infrastructure from the plague and drought that had also kind of beset the land. And again, it's important to note, like I was talking about earlier, about how this covenant was made with the ancient Nehekharans and their pantheon. In exchange for tithing, more or less, we will continue to make the land flourish. So this is where we enter Settra the Great. And while he by no means is the first king of Khemri, he's really the first king to really matter. And remember how we talked about all this land being given to the Nehekharans in exchange for worship and fealty to the gods, like we just said? Well, Settra remembered that. And none of the other kings did. And that's why you've got this torrid plague that's just kind of ripping through the land here. And he actually paid homage to the many patron gods of the Nehekharan pantheon. And this is really the beginning of his reign, was entirely devoted to rebuilding infrastructure and holy places. This was a two-pronged in that it rebuilt his faith with the gods as well as with the people. The people were very sick of this infighting, these civil wars, these kings quibbling over one another and their domains. So this guy was so dedicated that he sacrificed his own children in a grand ritual to show his commitment to the gods. I mean, he's up there. So the result is this grand river Nile, which is the Great Vitai River, that hadn't happened in over 50 years. And just like the River Nile, they rely on that constant flooding to produce these crops, to give them their infrastructure, to give them the whole entire reason that their society and their empire is strong. This kind of restored the crops to the land, and the people believe that Settra was actually blessed by the gods. And this cemented Settra's place as the first priest king, meaning he commanded both the people and the gods, or at least their power. He was kind of imbued with the power of the gods because he paid homage to them. And he was imbued by the power from the people because he was willing to work for and with the people. And, who commands gods? No one. The God Emperor of mankind, that's who. Wrong universe. Whoops. But he then went on to on a grand crusade, essentially kind of uniting the land under his rule. And with it, this new golden age kind of began. And Settra it's kind of a big thing here, because I talk about Settra so far, and that he's like, hey, he's just a really nice guy. He's very faithful. The people love him. Settra was not a benevolent ruler. He was fickle, ruthless, tyrannical, but really through his vice grip rule, all of Nehekhara flourished as he snuffed out any and all resistance to his monarchy. Kind of like the history of Vlad Tepes, and how the history of Vlad Dracula and how he is kind of looked at as tyrannical from the outside, but the people of Wallachia kind of look at him as like this grand savior. It's the same thing with Settra. He was able to really drive the invaders back from the age of strife and return Hekara to this land at its height. And he further bolstered the infrastructure and rebuilt this kind of war-torn and ravaged cities throughout the land. Everything was starting to really stand up on its own. And after restoring Hekara, he pushed ever onward. He was always looking to push those borders, and such is kind of the ambition of Settra that everything within his grasp must be conquered. Must go to a concert. But he extended well outside of the borders of Hekara, and even as far as Lustria and the coasts of what would become Bretonia and Athel-Loran. So he was all over the place. And this is when Big Daddy Settra kind of realized that he could not really accomplish everything in just one lifetime. There's this sweeping moment in the book that talks about him overlooking his entire kingdom from the Black Mountains. That's right by ancient Lamia, if you're wondering. Before he comes to this realization, and this is the long road to the full Tomb Kingdom, Toomish Kings, Toomey Kingers, King Tutus. You get the point. But obsessed with overcoming death and really vowing that the grave never take him, Settra founded what is the Mortuary Cult. And this cult was devoted to discovering the secrets of preventing, or secrets of immortality, or actually pointedly preventing him from dying. That's important distinction, I suppose. But so off these kind of priests of the Mortuary Cult went, potions, incantations, rituals, all of them really aimed at prolonging Settra's life. And they even went as far as extending their own lives in pursuit of their masters. And that's a pretty repeating motif of a lot of the priest kings of the time, is that their unflinching devotion, especially to Settra. A lot of what happens soon, what we're about to talk about, is willingly done. The Tomb Kings aren't, it doesn't really make it out as obvious as it is, but the Tomb Kings aren't necessarily pulled upon or aren't led by their own noses. They are willingly doing a lot of what they do. And it all is in favor of in honor or service to their king. It's very similar to the way that the ancient Egyptian society worked and how they regarded their king almost as a god. A direct descendant of. And this is where the priests kind of learn about mummification and body preservation and all means of really these arcane level enchantments, as they start to really they dabble with the winds of magic. And remember though, that humans don't know magic yet at all. Only the elves do. And humans learn magic predominantly from Teclis going and saying, hey, here's the College of Magic for you. But they're kind of like, ooh, what are these currents we can kind of tap into? But really try as they kind of might, the priests still could not really come up with a means to prevent Settra from dying. But they wholly believed they were onto a means to connecting the mortal realm with the realm of souls and bringing someone, a perfectly preserved mummy, back from the dead in a body that could withstand time. And Settra was just pissed as hell. He was known for having a terrible temper and regularly threw tantrums when reruns of Teletubbies would air, or when someone spoiled a damn Game of Thrones episode. Contracted the construction of a pyramid that he would rest in while the Mortuary Cult finished their task. Guys, he didn't watch Game of Thrones. It's not real. It's a show. But dying, the king kind of cursed the cult, who promised him that he would rule for millions of years after. Calm down, we're going to get you back into this. But Settra was interred in the greatest pyramid in the land, and just like the ancient pyramids of antiquity, it was blinding to look upon, and the grandest amongst all the ones to come before and after it. He's kind of like the trendsetter with it, but again, nothing comes bigger after this one. It was filled with all of his treasure, his servants, and his bodyguards, as well as the mighty legion that he had used to conquer and grow his kingdom. Nakaf, we've talked about, his herald would be mummified along with his liege, and heralding him in the afterlife, as well as this one that he was doing already. So again, this is all willingly done. This isn't just kind of, hey, we feel honor bound to do this. It's all by the legion, like, hey, yes, my lord, bury us in sand, fill our mouths with it, done. But all this kind of leads up to what is called the Day of Awakening. But with Settra's passing, there was a ton of to be expected infighting, and with kings come and go, legions being raised and falling, this kind of whole tumultuous age of kings as things kind of swap hands back and forth. So these grand armies of these burnished gold and rich blues, as the Egyptian-like hordes of Nehekhara drew and redrew their borders in blood, really. There was just tons of conflict in this time. And these kings kept the mortuary cult intact. They helped to feed and grow it to hopefully be risen again on the Day of Awakening, just like Settra. So each generations of priests, the original ones, kind of their techniques are a little bit more rudimentary, but each generation learns a little bit more and more and more about undeath, right? Until they really perfected the ability to bind their own souls to their bodies, preventing death as a whole. And the priesthood had been renamed at this time to Lich Priests. Their preternatural life and abilities kind of kept secret. They keep that close to this chest because they knew, okay, if we just tell everyone about this, everyone's going to follow suit with us. And that's not necessarily what Settra wanted. We wanted to bring Settra back, and if he comes back and realize that everyone else after him was kind of kept in perfect shape, Settra's going to be pissed. But the priest kings continued to supply them, and they continued to learn more and more. And one key thing left out of this immortal life was immortal youth. And as they grew old and withered, the priest kings kind of learned that difference, the hard and fast way. At this point, though, Nehekharan society as a whole became overly obsessed with death and immortality. Dejaf and Usurian, the gods of death and the underworld respectively, joined Petra in the chief gods of worship. You have Usurian being the chief god of, I guess the primary god of the head of the pantheon for the pantheonic mandala for high elves. Petra was that. Now it's Dejaf, Usurian, and Petra, so they're all kind of on that same plinth. It's kind of weird with Usurian. He ends up getting consumed by Nagash later in the end times. It's kind of, every time I see that name, I'm like, "Ooh, you got eaten by a giant skeleton." But mummification and preservation became a reward for the heroic deeds as the mortuary cult kind of grew in power vastly, and each passing king demanded a larger and larger pyramid, and built by the necrotex who we've talked about. They constructed these spanning statues, pyramids, and these necropolises that the Lich Priests filled with mummified remains. We kind of made that distinction earlier. But all great dynasties do have their end, and either with a series of bad rulers or invasions, Nehekhara did have theirs. Nagash, the necromancer, kind of started to rise at this point. And there was a king of Khemri named Khetep. He had a son, and his name was Nagash. Not a name I'd choose, but he rose to become a prominent Lich Priest, and his brother replaced his father as the king of Khemri, the king of Nehekhara, after King Khetep's death. Legitimate death. That's kind of important to notice for after what we're about to talk about. But shortly after this, he gathered together his kind of acolytes, and Arkhan the Black was one of these, and killed his brother, placing himself upon the throne. And there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens. There's this stuff that, the book kind of talks about, the army book kind of talks about, Nagash basically gathered his acolytes, went and assassinated his brother. But the assassination was pretty brutal, and then he tricks his brother's wife into hooking up with his son, who was actually his cousin. There's a lot of weird shit that goes on the very beginning of Nagash's reign to becoming Nagash. So even then, you have Nagash as a very twisted and outright evil character in the beginning of his history. In his end times incarnation, it's way different, but this began a reign of terror throughout the land as Nagash was twisted by dark magic, and as we've talked about before, he learned dark magic from dark elf sorceresses that he had captured. They had captured a raiding party that was harassing the coastline of Nehekhara, and he kind of has this kind of Harry Potter-esque duel where he kills all of them after he's learned everything from them. But this is where necromancy got its roots, and where the ideals of the mortuary cult really begin to fall to ruin, because he's in charge. He's in charge, in control. And Nagash constructed these kind of Horcruxes. I mean, he made 9 books of knowledge. Kind of sounds like a Horcrux to me. And the books of Nagash is what these are called. And that began the most powerful. These became the most powerful source of necromantic magic in the world. And he even created the elixir of life that gave immortality to anyone that drank it, but also enthralled them to Nagash for all eternity. We see this with what happens to the vampires, to all of his servants and acolytes like Arkhan the Black in the very beginning. But during this time, Nagash then went about erecting the grand black pyramid that we've heard so much about, that's kind of rummaged around, and we hear a little bit, we already see a little bit of it on the Total War Warhammer 2 campaign map. But he scours the lands for the resources to do this, and really he drives the populace from wherever he could in the populace. So he gets these slaves, he gets all the resources he can. He doesn't care. He's driving the economy into the ground. And this pyramid would be a means to harness vast amounts of winds of magic for him. And it took him 50 years to finish this black marble pyramid that made Settra's pyramid look like a used car lot. Like, he's the first one to kind of say, I'm going to build something grander than Settra. Screw him, he's dead. And the pyramid came really at a great cost in Nehekara. Most of the cities kind of fell into despair and ruin from the great toll of both manpower and riches that this took. The Priest Kings then rose up against Nagash, starting this war of the dead. And as the Priest Kings waged war against Nagash, he used his command of necromancy to raise this massive legion of skeletons. This being the first time, though, that such an act had happened. We don't see necromancy before this point in any history, and this terrified the hell out of the Nehekaran soldiers. They'd never seen this, and Nagash then went from city to city, just reclaiming the land in his name, kind of taking it over back from the rebellious Priest Kings at the time. So the armies, though, Priest Kings don't they're very proud lot. They don't kind of take things on their back, but the armies of 7 great Priest Kings band together with the might of the Mortuary Cult, who had summoned up the spirits of the many long dead heroes from the realm of souls. Remember, they can kind of convene with them. They've bridged that gap between the mortal and realm of souls here. And this is where we get the Necrolith Colossi, the Ushabti, the War Sphinxes, all these massive contracts with the eventual Tomb King roster. And this helped to really break the fear of fighting the undead, because it kind of helped level the playing field. Yeah, you've got a ton of undead over there, but I have like a 50-foot tall undead construct monster made of stone and souls. So 7 Tomb Kings won and drove Nagash all the way back to Khemri, where they eventually besieged the town and overtook it, slaughtering all of Nagash's followers and Arkhan, as he sacrificed himself to really kind of save his liege. He said, like, okay, hey, I'm going to throw myself in the way, kill me, and allowed Nagash to bounce on out that piece. Important to note, too, that this is going to be a repeating thing for the relationship between Arkhan the Black and Nagash. This happens throughout the entirety of the Warhammer history. Arkhan's always just jumping on nades for Nagash. Would never want to go to a bar with those two. While the war, though, kind of exhausted much of the land on Nehekara, a century later, it really paved the way for the rise of a ruler much akin to Settra in greatness. Alcatazar, the Conqueror, was really the next great king of Khemri, and he went a long way in restoring Nehekara to much of its former glory. But a lot of the damage had really already been done. He was able to unite the great cities under one king again for the first time in hundreds of years. But still, there was this growing mistrust toward the Mortuary Cult, especially after Nagash's treachery. And again, this is where the Mortuary Cult goes from being like, hey, if you're in the Mortuary Cult, it's like the pinnacle of society. Everyone kind of idolizes them because they're going to be the ones that bring us back during the Awakening, to after Nagash being like, hey, I'm not so sure I trust them. And the whole time, though, the Mortuary Cult has been, again, a really important distinction here. The Mortuary Cult itself, free of Nagash here, has been a baseline. It always has been the same level of devotion to the people and to Settra's great image of reawakening and restoring life to the grand rulers of Nehekara. They were never at any point were evil. Nagash maybe have twisted their intentions and their words in his small little spat, a small little reign, but at the very end of the day, Mortuary Cult does serve Nehekara. But as I kind of went on a tirade there, the Priest Kings kind of lusted for the power that Nagash was able to wield. Despite their growing fear of the Mortuary Cult, and that's kind of terrifying. They effectively restricted their ability to operate, hoping to prevent another Nagash 2.0. But this did not stop Neferata, the ruler of Lamia, who we've talked about, from breaking into the Black Pyramid and stealing away with a single book of Nagash. And from this, she created a corrupted version of the Elixir of Life, creating really the first vampire court in Lamia. And we've covered this in another video, like I was saying, and I'll link it at the end of this video so you guys can see her story and the rise and fall of the Lamian vampires. But Alcatazar doesn't really like this too much, so he comes and destroys Lamia along with her kind of corrupted court, and Neferata and her more chief lieutenants scatter out of Nehekara. And that kind of really starts to pave the way for the next big step and everything here. And unbeknownst to the vampires, they were actually tethered to Nagash's will, as he lay outside of Nehekara in Nagashazar, which is a really weird name. And after the fall of Lamia, he gathers all of them kind of fleeing vampires and used them as able generals and lieutenants for his next mighty army. They ran away, but eventually kind of got pulled by Nagash's will back to him. And Nehekara was once again beset by the undead legions of Nagash and his combined arms of vampires. So Alcatazar was really no slouch. He was considered the greatest general of the time, so he was a very important individual. And he is, again, the last real great king here. And he rallies all the armies of Nehekara against Nagash. And he's fought this battle before. The ancient Nehekarans were really prepared for this. So the Battle of Golden Skull saw the undead forces of Nagash just scattered. And his generals, the vampires, leave Nagash's service and they flee to their own safety. And this is where you get the Morcaine begins from here, because Ashoran flees to the north. Abhorash follows suit. The Lamian vampires kind of vanish off. The Necharchs kind of join in on Ashoran as well. You get this whole vampire society that begins to the north, which eventually spreads over to Sylvania after the fall of Morcaine. But Nagash is pissed. He's pissed. He curses all of vampiredom, so they can no longer go into the sunlight. They have to. They now have to fear like blessed items, like especially of Sigmar. They always had a thirst for blood that wasn't Nagash's result. It was a result of a corrupted version of the Elixir of Life. But he basically banishes them from the sun, and he's kind of full of this ire and bitterness. And Nagash, he himself was not defeated, just his army. So he goes a different route. He poisons the great river Vitae, which then becomes the great Mortis River that we already see today, that we see on the map of Total War Warhammer 2. And this choked out the central pinion of the Nehekaran society. This kills their means to produce what made them so strong. This cripples their infrastructure and ravages the land in plague. The Nehekarans slowly succumb to the war of attrition that Nagash had forced them into. And with the nation significantly weakened and the dead only adding to Nagash's numbers, he fell upon Khemri. And he removed Alcatazar and placed himself upon the throne. And things had taken quite a sudden turn and did not look well for the people of the Great Land, who Nagash was determined to create as a land of undead, shackled all to his will. But this kind of sets Nagash's plans in motion, his ambition given form as he started the great ritual back at his keep of Nagashazar. And the great ritual would, and this is something that we see in the end times as well, this great ritual would raise every dead being across the globe and shackle him to Nagash's will, while at the same time, though, killing everything. Nagash wanted a land of undead ruled over solely by him. And we find out in the end times that that's not because he was evil, it's because it was his best way to instill obedience in man, knowing that a man had free will, and the only way to have a land that was truly just and truly obedient was to remove that free will. It's a real weird perversion on his way of saying like, no, I'm doing the right thing. But all this started with Nehekhara eating away at the crops and all the people alike. He gave kind of like a 1-2 punch. The plague already kind of eating away at everyone, and he trying to like use his spell to raise those as well. And this kills the entirety of the land. People withered and died in mass as the king of necromancers was fed limitless magical energy from his great black pyramid, that finally coming to fruition for him. But far in the dungeons of Nagashazar, Alcatazar was freed by Skaven assassins and given a warp blade to go kill the Arch Lich. And killing Nagash, Alcatazar had seen the complete destruction of his people and his homeland, and he never really recovered from it. He kind of just fades off into history. He kind of goes a little mad because he's one of the only Nehekharans left alive for the most part. But this Nagash's great ritual still had a lasting effect on the land as the Nehekharans began to reanimate shortly after their deaths. And of course, when Alcatazar, as he's known in some circles, killed the necromancer, all of the undead Nehekharans fell to the ground. But this magic had permeated and seeped down to the kings of old, and it reanimates their armies and the mummified remains of the kings themselves. And what was promised to be a paradise to return to, the now tomb kings arise to their new desolate and destroyed homeland. What a way to end a vacation. But this kind of starts War of the Kings Part 2, and this goes into another warring period of Nehekhara. And this time it was filled with musty, dirty bandages and a smell that I can only possibly compare to 3-week-old pork chili. The Tomb Kings, though, had been interred in life, that had been interred in life, now warred for supremacy. And these dynasties, these hundreds of kings had risen and fallen since Settra's reign, and all of which were risen and demanded leadership of the land. The great Hierophant Katep, who we've talked about already, took it upon himself to finally release the seals on the Great Pyramid of Settra. And this is the only tomb that's untouched by Nagash's curse. And it's really a testament to the strength and the seals of enchantments wrought upon the pyramid by what is the pre-Supreme Mortuary Cult. These are the very first iteration of the Mortuary Cult had instilled such great wards and enchantments, and it's surprising to see that actually worked even on someone as powerful as Nagash. But out pops Settra, absolutely livid. At the head of his legion, though, he quells all of the insubordinate kings, destroying the lesser ones and bringing the rest to heel, even the mighty Arkhan the Black. And Settra does not serve, he rules. So after bending the entirety of the land over the proverbial barrel, Settra took up his former position in Khemri as the king of Nehekhara. And here Katep briefed him on all that had happened, and Settra was already furious going into the tomb and was even more furious coming out. He was not the immortal ruler over an untouched paradise that he was meant to be. Katep told Settra of Nagash the entire 2,000 some odd years of history up to this point, and finally of the curse that triggered the awakening. And Settra then commanded that all of the Tomb Kings be put back to sleep, and he would remain awake, rising armies as needed and looking over the land. And this thus begins Settra's rule, or what is called the Reign of a Million Years. And this is the time that we will see the Tomb Kings in Total War Warhammer 2. They will be in the middle of this reign of a million years. And a lot of people have asked, the Tomb Kings don't really leave their land. Not overly true. There is actually, at the end of all this in the army book, they talk about a big raiding party of Norskins, of 12 important Norskins leading a Norskin horde, and how they attack Nehekhara, and Settra rides out to meet them with his army, and he fights their Marauder Lord. And the Marauder, they basically gib each other at the same time. He hits him in the chest, or he hits him, sorry, too many pronouns. The Marauder Lord hits Nehekhara, or Settra, in the chest with a flaming axe, and he bursts into flames, but not before Settra had severed the head of his horse and then kills that guy. So off pops the crown of Nehekhara, which these 12 prominent marauders take back to all of Norska. And from there, we have the mighty Settra the Impenetrable kind of coming back to life. And he comes back to life about 10 years later or something like that. And then boots on up to Norska out of Xandri. Xandri is the great port city of Nehekhara that I've talked so much about. And from Xandri, he has basically this giant fleet of Tomb King, of undead. And he brings the full might of his armies against Norska and just cuts a path through everything. And finally, he recovers the crown and comes back. But that's something to note here, that the Tomb Kings do come out of their land when it does serve Settra's will. So that does obviously happen. The end times for Settra, I've talked a lot about Settra in this, more so than I have in the individual lore video dedicated to him, but it's because the lore of Settra is so ingrained in the lore of Nehekhara that I couldn't do it justice to just kind of talking only about Settra without talking about both. But the end times sees a really crazy story with Settra, and he becomes so much more... He's already a pretty rich character, and even in the end times he gets even richer. Like, he kind of squares off against Nagash after Nagash is devoured Usirian, and Nagash basically blows him up. And the Chaos Gods reassemble his body and say, hey, we'll give you all this power. And he's like, sure, whatever. But again, this is where we get the Settra does not serve, he rules. He tells that to Nagash, and Nagash is like, blow you up. So he goes over to Arkhan and is like, hey, Settra does. I'll go over to Arkhan and goes, I'll join your army. Let me be your ally. I'm not serving you, but I'll be your ally. And he says, okay, well, go kill Kolek, because Kolek is insubordinate. He's not going to follow me. I want him dead. So he goes and fights Kolek for like 4 days on end, and then beheads Kolek, because, it's Settra. And he then, after that, kind of like pulls a coup, more or less, and says, now I'm going to kill you, Archaon, for trying to rule over me, but first I'm going to kill all the Chaos Gods for trying to trick me into being ruled over. So Settra's just this constant badass in the lore. No one ever gets one over on him, because he's always like, oh, I'm just going to come back and kill you. I'm just gonna fucking kill everything you own. But that is the lore of Nehekhara. That is the history of the Tomb Kings and how they are and why they are the way that they are. In our next video, we'll be delving into each and every unit, the individual history of those units, and the lore blurbs thus attached. Hopefully you guys got a really good idea of how the Tomb King Society kind of rose and fell, or how the Priest King Society rose and fell and became the Tomb King Society. But if you do have any questions or comments, I have not personally read a lot of the fluff books, the books from Black Library that were released outside the Army books. So if you have read it, specifically the one about the whole torrid beginning portion of Nagash's history and how he just goes on a murder Oedipus Rex weird rampage, feel free to chime in on that. I'll definitely pin it and keep it to the top so people can see what happens there. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Have a good one and take care.